Welcome to the What Really Happened radio show. The history the government hopes you never learn. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome to our show. It's Friday, September 20th, 2013. Thank goodness it's Friday. Thank goodness it's Friday. Looking forward to what I hope will be a relaxing weekend after the very, very stressful last few weeks here. Our phone lines are open, 800-313-9443, 800-313-9443. Sam is in our control room, ready to answer the phone when you call on in. Obviously, the top news of the moment is the U.S. House of Representatives voted for a temporary emergency spending bill that will allow the federal government to go on spending with wild, reckless abandon into December, avoiding the shutdown that was being warned of for a little over a week away. But in the process, they included language that completely defunds Obamacare. And it did pass. And I understand that there are ashtrays flying around the Oval Office as I speak. Now, the bill has to go to the Senate. This is the constitutional process. Revenue measures must originate in the House of Representatives. They didn't do that with TARP, by the way, but now it has to go to the Senate for approval. Now, the Senate is expected to remove the language defunding Obamacare, then they'll pass the emergency spending measure. The problem is, of course, both bills have to somehow be brought into accord, and that means we're looking at another week of pro wrestling on Capitol Hill. You know, we must fund Obamacare, we must defund it, and back and forth so they can stand up there and look like they're accomplishing something actually useful. And in the end, you know, unless you flood Capitol Hill with your phone calls to your representatives, they'll go, well, we must keep the government going, even if it means saddling people with Obamacare, which is how slaves are made throughout history. Yes, it's immoral, it's illegal, it's unethical, but we must do it for the greater good, meaning the continuation of your tax money flowing into their pockets here. So everybody's out there saying a possible government shutdown on October 1st, and hey, I think that's a good idea. I think we ought to shut it down permanently because this government is not working for we the people anymore. And remember what happened over in Belgium, where their federal government collapsed and couldn't restart for something like over a year? And life got really good for those people. And then finally a new central federal government formed, and things are not so good anymore, but there's an example. And the early United States is another example. The early United States did not have this strong, tyrannical central government. It was engineered out in the Constitution. Power and authority was diffused across all of the states and resided with the people. And the nation grew and prospered and blossomed and became a world power. Then we got this gigantic central federal government. And you can look around and see how things have really gone to pot as far as ordinary life for ordinary Americans here. Now, somebody just did a survey here among federal government employees and found out that 92% of them are opposed to Obamacare. The only people who are still supporting Obamacare are the large insurance companies who are going to reap untold billions of profits on this thing, the people who are getting paychecks for being navigators and administrators of the new program, the Internal Revenue Service, which gets to administer, which is weird because I don't recall that the Internal Revenue Service really knows anything at all about health and health care. But they are in there because I guess this whole mode of operation for Obamacare is that if you are taking care of your own health and you are not sick and you don't need any medical care, you have to pay a fine to the IRS. That seems to be what the rules all distill down to. But 92% of federal government workers do not want this. Obama is still pushing it, and I think more than anything else, he's listening to his ego. He's taken hits on IRS Gate, Benghazi Gate, NSA Gate, EPA Gate. Oops, my bad, I left something turned on I ought not to have. And Obama's taken a clubbing over this Syria nonsense. And he's worried about his legacy. He wants something he can point to with pride. I brought Obamacare to the nation, and he's still out there pushing it. Because now it's just all about ego and vanity, and I'm the president, and I'm going to do what I want to do here. And if I say all Americans have to whack their thumbs with hammers, by golly, they're going to go out and do it. Now, I've been asking lately, considering the poor quality of decision-making that we see coming out of Washington, D.C., do they really all think we're that stupid that we're buying all the lies and propaganda? Or are they all on SSRIs or something? But there's a third possibility, and I think it's a case of denial. Everybody in Washington, D.C. grew up in an age where there was plenty of money out there in the country that could be harvested with this or that scam, and the American people were very naive and trusting of anything the government or the corporate media told them. And I think inside the Beltway, insulated from the real world by layers and layers of bureaucrats and interns and staffers, they still think they're living in that world of the 1970s and 1980s. But they aren't. And they don't realize it, and that's why the situation is so dangerous here right now. They still don't get it, how dramatically the world has changed around them here. Now, getting on over to the D.C. shooter, I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that today, but I do have to mention it. The finger-pointing has begun. Chuck Hagel is out there saying the military missed the red flags on the shooter. They should have... Whose fault is it? And they're pointing the finger everywhere, except, of course, at the Trazodone that Aaron Alexis was on, which has a well-documented history of triggering random acts of violence. And now they're trying to dump the blame on this private contractor, USIS, which is a company that processes security clearances for the United States government. And the problem with that whole model of we're going to take this individual and we're going to check his background and we think he's perfectly trustworthy and sane and so forth, and we put him into these government positions. But people change over time. Now, this USIS not only cleared Aaron Alexis for his credentials, they also cleared Edward Snowden. But people change over time, either through a moral conscience, which is what happened with Ed Snowden. He looked at what he was being told to do and just said, I can't do this anymore. It's morally wrong, it's unconstitutional, it's a sign of dictatorship, and he had to do something about it. Or, as in the case with Aaron Alexis, through the influence of these prescribed medications. And there's the real danger. You could vet somebody and examine somebody all that you want, give them a top secret, need-to-know clearance, Olympus class security clearance. And if in the course of their work they come under stress and depression, they get prescribed these medications, their behavior will become unpredictable, and the vetting for the security clearance won't have anything on it. That's the real danger. Now, we did link a couple more documentaries to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com about these medications. One of them is very, very interesting because it documents how they knew these drugs were a problem back in 1991. And this video is just all this testimony that was being given to the FDA about all the violence and suicide and just insane behavior being triggered by these medications. They know it's a problem, but we don't want to risk those campaign donations from big pharmaceutical companies, so we can't do anything. It's really for the greater good. And I actually got into an online debate yesterday with somebody about these things, saying, well, they don't turn everybody who takes them into, homicidal maniacs and serial killers. And say, no, they don't, but they do turn some of them into it. Are you like saying it's okay to allow 10 people to be turned into mass shooters because the other 30 people who took these medications were okay with them? Like it's a numbers game. Well, the amount of people being harmed is less than the amount of people being helped, therefore it's okay to go on selling this stuff. By the way, up in Chicago, they've had another shooting incident there. 2 gunmen opened fire on a Chicago basketball court. 13 people wounded, no fatalities, thankfully, including a 3-year-old got hit. And you probably did not see a lot of this on the corporate media because, remember, Chicago is held up as the model for gun control. In fact, only last month they signed even more restrictive gun laws into law in Illinois. And, of course, the criminal gangs are running rampant there. It completely discredits the idea that banning guns will lower crime. Chicago's the proof of it will be. And right aloha, then. America. Welcome to the show. And I'm looking at an article over at the Journal of Patient Safety, and we just posted it to the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. And it was an attempt to go out and update estimates of patient harm through flawed, erroneous medical care here in the United States of America. Now, the last firm number they had was going back to 1984, where it was estimated that 98,000 Americans die every year from mistakes made by their doctors. Ban doctors, 15-day waiting period to fill prescription. This crisis and loss of life must stop. Ms. Pelosi. Apparently the numbers are now much, much worse. As our costs of medical care go up, the quality continues to go down. And the numbers that this report came up with is that the true number of premature deaths associated with preventable harm to patients is estimated at more than 400,000 Americans every single year. And they're saying serious harm, permanent serious harm to patients caused by medical mistakes runs between 4 million and 8 million cases per year. Now you know why Claire and I stay away from doctors. But the assault rifles are the problem. We've got to get the assault rifle. We have to get this under control. So if you look at a failure rate like that, 400,000 deaths per year in the medical industrial complex, 4 million to 8 million cases of serious long-term harm caused by medical mistakes. Is it really so unbelievable that some of these prescription medications are being sold on the market knowing that they actually cause harm? Because they're profitable. As long as we're making money, that forgives all sins. And hey, if there's an adverse reaction, we'll just bring them back in and give them another medication. In fact, we have seen that when we go through SSRI stories and we read a lot of these documents about people who were driven to suicide and acts of mass violence. We hear the same thing over and over again. The doctor suggests they take an antidepressant. It doesn't work. They go back to the doctor. The doctor says, well, here, try this one. That doesn't work, and the symptoms are getting worse, and the patient comes back, and the doctor says, well, here, I'll write you a third prescription. Doctor's making money off the deal, the pharmacy's making money off the deal, and the patient gets worse and worse and worse until there is a breakdown, and they cause harm not only to themselves, but people around them. Our entire society has become completely dominated by those pieces of ink and paper, and all other considerations seem to have vanished from our culture. And again, I don't have a problem with people wanting to make money. I'd like to be rich myself. But for a society to function smoothly, there has to be a balancing of priorities. Yes, let's put out this product and make some money with it, but at the same time, let's make sure this product is safe for everyone to use. Let's just not run a numbers game saying, well, the people that it doesn't hurt will give us enough money so we can pay off the lawsuits from the people it did hurt. By the way, the Julia Roberts movie, Erin Brockovich, is making the rounds on cable again. And if you haven't seen it, it's worth a look because it's based on a true story of how Pacific Gas and Electric in a Southern California town called Hinckley poisoned the groundwater with hexavalent chromium, which is highly, highly toxic, lied to the community, said it was chromium-3, which is actually healthy for you, and just covered it up for year after year after year after year while these people in Hinckley were coming down with cancers and tumors and all kinds of serious medical problems. And the corporate masters said, we're making money. Screw Hinckley. We'll give them a few coins to make things all better. It's kind of like that opening scene from A Tale of Two Cities where the rich person in his carriage runs down and kills a small child and he just flips a gold coin out the window and thinks that's going to make it seem all better. And it didn't. Alrighty, let's go over to Syria. Now, already today on the corporate media, I'm seeing the focus begin to shift away from Syria and back onto Iran. They're back to talking about Iran's nuclear threat. Oh my goodness, they've got a power station. We can't allow that. It's the end of the world. Now, Syria has just pulled off a brilliant move. They are calling for a ceasefire with the rebels, and they're going to advocate for one at the Geneva II Peace Conference, assuming it ever actually takes place. But with Assad going out there and saying, let's stop the fighting and sort things out diplomatically, that yanks the rug out from under any U.S. invasion of Syria. Of course, the U.S. goal in Syria is to get rid of Assad and put in a government that is going to be more amenable to U.S. and Israeli interests, which is also what they're doing down in Egypt right now. So Russia is now complaining that the UN chemical weapons inspectors who were in Syria during that August 21st gas attack have pointedly ignored other evidence presented to them not only by Syria but by Russia, because there were additional chemical attacks during that same time period that very obviously were by the rebels. And remember, in this August 21st attack, the women and children who were targeted were identified as being part of the Alawite faction, who are Assad supporters. That's how absurd this story has been. You know, Assad allows the UN inspectors in. On the day they arrive, he gasses his own supporters and his own soldiers right in front of the UN inspectors. That's what the U.S. government's trying to sell you. Which is probably why John Kerry looked the way he did yesterday when he was out there one more time saying, yes, we know that Assad gassed his people, and you should believe us because we're the U.S. government. No, actually, we should disbelieve you because you're the U.S. government, because you lie all the time about everything. Article over at David Duke's website is pointing out something that has been obvious all along. The Syrian intelligence is dubious. He's being far more polite than I would. The Syrian intelligence is bovine excrement. And he says it comes from Israel. And you should doubt it on that ground, because Israel was out there screaming that Saddam had nuclear weapons. Israel was out there screaming that Egypt was trying to sink the USS Liberty. And a lot of people, a lot of experts, people who've been inside the government, have come forward to say this story makes no sense at all. And the U.S. government can't back off and said, yeah, you caught us, we were lying and making it up. Now they're stuck with trying to support a lie that nobody believes. And all they can do from this point on is further destroy their credibility in the eyes of the American people. About high time as well. Somebody pointed out in an article over at Electronic Intifada about all these terrorism experts that are showing up all over the British media are all tied into Israel's political establishment. Israel funds these institutions in various countries, like Memory and various others. They staff them with people with links to Israel and Israeli intelligence. And then they're promoted as impartial, objective experts on terrorism. And they get out there and say, oh yes, it's always the Arab Muslims, it's always the Palestinians, it's always those, you should go hate them. It's all just propaganda. We live in an age of lies. Just saturated with lies. Story over at johnfriend.net. Israel and the Jewish lobby demanding more U.S. taxpayer dollars. In other news, the sun rose this morning. The sun always rises, and Israel's always asking for more money. Amazing stuff. Meanwhile, the ADL is now trying to convince YouTube to take down Hispan TV's YouTube page, because apparently us Goyim are not allowed to see anything that Israel doesn't want us to see. We'll be right welcome back to the show here. So, getting back to the situation over in the Middle East, the United Nations, specifically the IAEA, just voted down the Arab push for a nuclear-free Middle East on the grounds that they were unfairly targeting Israel for criticism. Which is like saying we're going to try and ban drunk driving, but we don't want to unfairly point to the one drunk driver who's actually here in the room. Because Israel is the only nation in the Middle East with a nuclear arsenal. Officially, it's still ambiguous, but that's complete and utter nonsense. Germany confirmed they've known for years that Israel arms those Dolphin-class submarines with nuclear-tipped cruise missiles. Israel openly talks about their nuclear arsenal in the Knesset now. It's a matter of public record inside Israel. And, of course, documents that surfaced from the former government of South Africa confirmed Israel's been trying to sell nuclear weapons to other countries, which is the very activity the Non-Proliferation Treaty is supposed to prevent. But Iran is the danger. Iran's power station is the danger. No, they're not. The danger is everywhere. And by the way, a little piece of interesting history. Back in 1961, over the city of Goldboro, Goldsboro, North Carolina, a B-52 came apart in midair and dropped 2 hydrogen bombs on the town of Goldsboro, North Carolina. Now, the official story was that there was never any danger because the physics package, which is the polite name for the initiators that actually start the nuclear cascade leading to a nuclear detonation, had not been installed on the bombs. But apparently, a secret document, which was obtained through a Freedom of Information Act, reported the bombs were not only armed, but one of them came within a single switch of detonating. And these bombs were 4 megaton bombs, 260 times more powerful than the one that was dropped on Hiroshima. Goldsboro would have vanished immediately. And they came within one single switch supplied by the lowest bidder to having a nuclear detonation, an H-bomb, go off on the United States of America. And the fact that they lied to us about, there was never any real danger, of course, in this age we know the government lies about everything. But here's the question I want to pose. Had that bomb detonated, had the impact shorted out that switch and allowed the bomb to detonate, what would the U.S. government have done? Would they have said, oops, our bad, we just nuked an American city? Or would they have lied again, maybe claimed it was a Russian attack? And considering how close we came during the later Cuban Missile Crisis, just gone ahead and launched a nuclear world war. Get them gosh darn commies. Because we know from many other examples that when the U.S. government screws up, they are not forthcoming with we the people who own this country, who are expected to pay all the bills and sacrifice the lives of our children in these wars. We know this government lies about everything. If there had been a nuclear detonation over North Carolina, would the government have said, how can we use this crisis to move our agenda along? Well, let's get rid of those commies while we're at it. Now, speaking of moving forward, once again, Israel is out there screaming, there's no time left for negotiations with Iran. And this Israeli minister's out there saying, Iran is on a course to develop a nuclear bomb within 6 months. Time has run out. You must attack them now. Now, Israel's been saying that Iran is months away from a nuclear bomb going back to 1985. Every couple of months we get from Israel, Iran is on the verge of a bomb, Iran's on the verge of a bomb, and nobody has ever come up with any proof at all that Iran is using their nuclear technology for anything other than the peaceful purposes to which it is legally entitled under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, which Iran has signed, the United States has signed, Israel still refuses. Now, Iran has not launched a war of aggression in over 200 years. It is not their nature. This stands as a stark contrast to Israel and the United States, who can't seem to go 6 months without attacking someone. And even if Iran did have a nuclear weapon, they're not stupid enough to attack either the United States or Israel without some kind of provocation, because both the United States and Israel are nuclear powers capable of turning Iran into a giant glowing green glass parking lot in retaliation. What we have here, once again, is Israel screaming that you Americans must go kill Israel's enemies one more time. And this is a futile endeavor, because Israel is making enemies faster than your kids can kill them. Now, on a more pragmatic note, this push for war with Iran does risk war with Russia and China, and in case you are not aware of this, Russia and China really do have nuclear weapons and the delivery systems to shoot back at us. Do you want to risk a nuclear war with Russia and China just because Israel is whining that we should not like Iran? And if you, like me, think that Israel should just go fight their own wars and leave us alone, and that we should not get into a nuclear world war, this is another reason for you to call the Capitol Hill switchboard and the White House comment line and email and contact all your representatives and say this insanity has gone far enough. We are risking the incineration of the surface of planet Earth because Israel can't seem to get along with its neighbors. Of course, here in the United States of America, Israel has their obedient slaves bowing and debasing themselves before mighty Tel Aviv, and Senator Lindsey Graham is up there in the Congress right now trying to put through a measure seeking a congressional authorization for a U.S. attack on Iran. Here's your rifle, Lindsey. Here's your parachute. We have no reason to go to war against Iran. Iran has not attacked the United States of America. Iran hasn't attacked anybody in 200 years. Even if Iran has a nuclear weapon, they're not going to attack the United States of America because the United States of America has thousands and thousands of nuclear weapons and delivery systems. Have you noticed how all this war propaganda is all based on the assumption that these foreign leaders are doing these insanely stupid things, like gassing their own supporters in front of the UN weapons inspectors? And remember, this government lied right to your face with malice aforethought and no sense of shame at all that Saddam had nuclear weapons. Based on all this information that our wonderful ally Israel gave us, all of which turned out to be forged. And so Lindsey Graham is over there davening to Tel Aviv and saying, yes, Massa, I will throw our American children onto a war on Iran because you don't like Iran. And risk a nuclear conflict with Russia and China in the process. Meanwhile, we're getting word from over on DefenseWeb that the U.S. Army's AFRICOM, is now soliciting private contractors for deploying U.S. military equipment into 55 countries inside Africa, starting this month. Remember what I said, that this whole war is really all about forcing the world back onto Bretton Woods and forcing all the resource-rich areas of the world to sell their resources only for U.S. dollars? Africa's a prize. It's the largest untapped, undeveloped source of mineral wealth left on the planet. Remember when Germany asked for their gold back from the Bank of France and the New York Federal Reserve, and the Bank of France and the New York Federal Reserve said, it's going to take us a little while, and then the following week they invaded Mali, which is Africa's third largest gold producer. It doesn't get more obvious than that what all these wars are all about. It's about money. It's about wealth. It's about trying to pay the unpayable debt of the private central bankers by stealing wealth from other nations. Private central banking inevitably leads to the necessity for wars of conquest to keep that pyramid ticking along just a little bit longer. What a stupid idea it is to risk a global nuclear war for the sake of a Wall Street bank ledger staying black at the bottom. All right, we've got to take a break for commercials. Phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. America, welcome back to the show here. And I'm noticing the corporate media is actually starting to pay some attention over the growing opposition to the Common Core federally mandated educational standards. And as we pointed out earlier in the week, we have discovered that some of the mandatory textbooks being put out under Common Core by organizations linked to Common Core are attempting to rewrite the Constitution and the Bill of Rights to brainwash our children into not understanding the rights that they have that this government is supposed to respect. Now remember, government doesn't grant rights, it recognizes them. If they can take them away, they're not rights, they're privileges bestowed on particularly obedient slaves by a benevolent master, sometimes. So apparently the opposition to Common Core is building along with opposition to Obamacare. And I think it's reflective of a general opposition of the American people against this entire tyrannical, unconstitutional, illegitimate government here. Now then, interesting article came out of Digital Journal because you probably remember some years ago I uncovered this pamphlet printed at taxpayer expense by the FBI and distributed to police departments across the country, defining what a potential terrorist was. And it included people who talked about the Constitution. Use the Constitution, go to jail. And by the way, I also noticed the corporate media covered that story about how out in California on Constitution Day, the school administration forbade the distribution of the Constitution and the student union and said, you have to go into this little tiny free speech cage and you can hand out all the pamphlets you want in there. It's out behind the water treatment facility. But apparently the FBI has now updated their list of what constitutes a potential terrorist in the United States of America, and on that list are people who doubt the official 9/11 story, which is the majority of Americans now. So now the FBI is telling police departments and communities against terrorism to consider anyone who expresses doubt about the official 9/11 story to be a potential terrorist. He's a potential terrorist. You don't want to listen to what he has to say. Don't pay attention to the videos. Don't even listen to his question about how the Secret Service knew that they could leave President Bush safe there in the school with an airport only 4 miles away. You don't want to listen to them. They're potential terrorists. Boy, you can just smell the fear coming out of Washington, D.C. That list of what constitutes a potential terrorist now encompasses the vast majority of the American people, and it betrays a mindset of the federal government seeing itself at war with the 50 states and the American people. The First Amendment recognizes our right to always question the official story about everything. And we should, because of all the times we have been lied to throughout our history. I am at great pains to find something this federal government didn't lie about. So, alrighty, let's get on to the economy here a little bit as we head up to the top of the hour. Ron Paul is out there basically saying that this week's decision by the Fed to continue the quantitative easing, which is just creating $85 billion a month out of thin air, and using half of it to buy those failed mortgage security bundles off of Wall Street and dump them on the American people. And the other half is to buy U.S. Treasury bonds to keep the government going, because nobody else wants to buy those Treasury bonds. And Ron Paul is saying what it comes down to is Bernanke is literally saying the economy is in bad shape. They have to go on propping it up by simply inflating the money supply and dumping it onto the banks to keep it looking like they're still functioning. The way the stock market took off following the Fed announcement underscores how dependent the financial centers are on that continued flow of brand new money. Left to themselves, they can't financially succeed. They don't have products to sell that anybody's buying. They would collapse immediately. They're literally on life support. They're in the ER, and the little scope is going, and they have this IV coming from the Federal Reserve into Wall Street's arm, just pumping and pumping and pumping, and they can't slow it down and they can't turn it off. And by doing it, they're destroying the value of the dollar. And it's this weird irony. By overinflating the dollar to save Wall Street from its own frauds and corruptions, to keep them propped up, they're destroying the credibility of the dollar around the world, but as nations start saying we want to use something other than the dollar, they get war declared on them. Is that not the height of absolute insanity? Now, Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis President James Bullard is responding to criticism over the continuing of quantitative easing by saying, well, we might taper off next month. Ever seen an addict? I'll start quitting next month. I'll quit after Christmas holidays. I'll quit after New Year. That's what we're seeing here. They know what they're doing is wrong. They know what they're doing in the long run is going to be destructive of the U.S., but they can't quit. What started as an emergency temporary measure has now become absolute necessary. And it all goes back to that mortgage-backed security fraud of 2008, where they sold these things around the world, and then when it was exposed as a fraud, they had to buy them back. And their solution is, well, we'll just dump them on the American people. And that is fascism. When they make money, they get to keep it, spend it lavishly on themselves and their friends. And when they lose money, when they have a disaster, it's transferred onto the American people, and that is fascism. And our nation has been a fascist economic state since the 1980s S&L bailout, if not even earlier than that. We are not a capitalist nation anymore. And those Occupy protesters who are out there on their second anniversary, they're not anti-capitalist, they're anti-fascist. They're pro-capitalist. We want to go back to the system of capitalism that worked for the American people before the money junkies just gamed the system to bring themselves trillions in unearned wealth by changing the rules to give the House a higher percentage. Now, over in Germany, we've got a lot of big military helicopters overhead right now, just rattling the walls. Over at the Bank of International Settlements, they've basically issued a statement. Has not been covered in the American media, but was covered in the German media, and we have a translation at whatreallyhappened.com. And what this article basically says, coming from the Bank of International Settlements, which is the private central banker's private central bank. This is the one at the top of that global pyramid of all of these Ponzi schemes. They took all the little pyramids and they built them into a single giant pyramid, and the Bank of International Settlements is at the top. And what this statement basically says is they have lost control of the debt cycle. In other words, the pyramid is starting to collapse. And that's probably the reason why, despite earlier suggestions of tapering quantitative easing this week, the Federal Reserve turned around and said, no, we got to keep it going. The Bank of International Settlements is now saying the system is starting to crash from the top down. And because it is one single system around the world, there's a wonderful opportunity, because if all of these private central banks come crashing down at the same time, it opens the doorway to a future civilization without these predatory private central banks. And we must be prepared to seize that opportunity. That's why when we talk about the blueprint for the new America, rule number 1, no private central banks. Rule number 2, no private central banks. Rule number 3, no private central banks. That has to be carved in stone on every single building in every state and federal capital around the country. Thou shalt not have private central banks issuing the public currency as a loan at interest, because they always, without failure, lead to global wars and collapse. So here we are 5 years after the mortgage-backed security fraud collapsed. Oops. Okay. I guess we're hitting our break just a little bit early today. And we're going to take off here and have Phyllis Shapley and some commercials, and we will be right back. America, welcome back to the show. We're going to go to the phones here. Art, aloha, Art. Welcome back to the show. What's on your mind?
Hey, Mike. Talking about what could make a possible domestic terrorist. And if you look at those 25 flyers that the FBI put out a few years ago, you can go through these things and you can find at least on each single flyer one item that pertains to every single individual in this country.
I scored on every single one of them except being, fundamentalist Christian, because that was on the list as well here. And I want to make it very clear right now for all those government agents who are monitoring my show here, I'm not a terrorist. I'm annoying, obnoxious, and irritating, but I am not a terrorist.
But yeah, I with the exception of that one that you cited, I scored really high on that test.
Well, you should be proud. It means you're a real American.
I am very proud. I consider myself to be among some pretty damn good company. But, all you have to do is there is one item in all of the list of everything they say that could, constitutes a possible domestic terrorist. There is one very specific item in this entire list that pertains to every single person in this country over the age of 5, including everybody in Washington. One item.
And that is?
those who use the Federal Reserve note.
Now, wait a minute. I never saw that one on the list. They're saying that everybody who uses the Federal Reserve note is a potential terrorist. That doesn't make any sense at all. I think it would be more likely for them to say anybody who questions the legitimacy of the Federal Reserve is a potential terrorist.
Right. It says those who use cash.
Okay. Okay. What they're not saying is those who use the Federal Reserve note specifically, but they're saying those who prefer to deal in cash and not have on, tracking of credit cards and the rest of it, are potential terrorists because, they're not allowing us to spy on all their financial transactions. And, of course, it's got nothing to do with terrorism. It has to do with the fact that we do have a constitutional right to privacy, and it's none of the government's business if on the way home from work I stop at the bakery and indulge in a jelly-filled donut, even though I'm supposedly on a diet. And that's a legitimate desire for privacy, and it's none of the government's business if I stop at the bakery or the adult bookstore or any of these other little things that all Americans are doing from time to time. It isn't the government's business, and I have a right to protect my private life from the government, and that doesn't make me a terrorist. But that's what that's all about, the idea that anybody who doesn't want all of their financial activity under constant government scrutiny is a potential terrorist. It's got nothing to do with it, whether it's Federal Reserve or anything else.
Well, that's where I remember seeing you, Mike, was down at the local adult bookstore. No, seriously, I mean,
it was a present for my wife. What can I tell you?
Oh, okay. Well, okay. We'll let that one. But it's amazing, the most ridiculous things that they say. I mean, people if you use binoculars, if you have a watch on your wrist and you look at your watch, I mean, when I go to a ball game, I don't see so good. I need those binoculars if I'm going to see the play.
I have a watch on my wrist, and I'm always looking at it. It's a habit I picked up back when I was working for NASA, because everybody's always working on a clock. Everybody's always on a countdown over there. And I have binoculars. I have a very nice set of astronomy binoculars that were a gift from my lovely wife that I'm always out looking, because where we live right now, we have an excellent view, and I like enjoying that view. And there's a lot of whale watching that goes on just off the coast here. It's really getting absurd, and I understand some of these other things. If you're taking pictures of public buildings, what if you're an architecture student? It's just completely over the top. It's giving the government a reason to say, aha, we're suspicious of you, therefore you have no more constitutional right to privacy.
Yeah, here's another really great one. If you've been to a tattoo shop, how many people in Congress do you think have tattoos?
I really don't care to find out, because just the image of them standing naked in front of me is enough to make me hurl.
Mike, I mean, what they've done is they have effectively made every single person in this country an enemy.
No, they've made them a suspect so that they're comfortable violating our Fourth Amendment rights. Oh, we don't have to respect your privacy, you're using cash. We don't have to respect your privacy, you've got binoculars. We don't have to respect your privacy, you're looking at your watch too much. Or
remember, it started out if you had more than 7 days worth of food. Now it's if you have more than 3.
Really? Well, that's going to be the entire country, because all those truckers are planning that nationwide strike October 11th through the 13th. Anybody with any common sense is going to have a week's worth of food in their home by October 10th. Does that make them all terror suspects? That's absurd.
Yeah, and here's I wanted to ask you this also, Mike, and then I'll let you get on with it. You were talking earlier about this standoff that they're having in Washington now over the budget, and I was reading an article this morning talking about they had approved some cuts in food stamps and so on.
$39 billion over the next 10 years, even as food stamp usage goes up. And I can tell you from direct experience here on the island of Oahu, the food stamp money as it is before the cuts only gets through week number 3 of every month.
All right, but here's where I'm going with this. It said in this article that the government was due to shut down October 1st if they did not reach an agreement. Now, we know they've got this bill going. It's passed through the House, which defunds Obamacare. Now it's got to go to Senate, as you were talking about earlier in the broadcast. But here's what I'm wondering. If we think about this, and we consider the fact that, you know, FEMA Region 3, which includes Virginia, West Virginia, Delaware, New Jersey, and Maryland, and of course Washington, D.C. is right in the heart of that. And all these preparations and things that must be in place by October 1st for FEMA Region 3. What do you think? I mean, if you just had to take a wild guess, what do you think would happen with all of these preparations going in place, deadline October 1st, and let's say for the sake of argument, they do not reach an agreement and the government shuts down October 1st? Do you think there's like a correlation here, maybe a connection in some way?
I think it may be more of a causal relationship because from the point of view of furthering the war agenda, the United States is out of options. Nobody's buying all of this stuff about Syria's gas and Iran's nuclear bombs. And yet, from the point of view of Wall Street and the government, the war is an absolute necessity because if they don't complete this war, if they don't complete forcing the world back onto Bretton Woods, the U.S. economy is finished, and with it the federal government. So we're at the point right now where I am absolutely convinced they're at least considering a false flag attack on the United States to blame on Iran, Russia, China, whatever, to really kick off World War III for real. And they're making the preparations. Now, it doesn't mean they're committed to doing it. They just want to have all the assets in place, and then at the last second there'll be a go, no-go decision being made. It's like all these emergency drills that we see surrounding all of the terror events. It's just everybody gets into position, oh, it's only a drill, or go green, and it goes live at that point. And the way that we're going to prevent them from trying a new false flag attack here in the United States is to keep hammering on all members of Congress and the White House and the media that we, the people, don't trust them anymore. We know they are lying. We know they play dirty tricks. We have to shatter their confidence that they can pull off another deception and be believed by the majority of the American people. And if we can make them doubt, they'll call it off. And that is our goal right now, with all the phone calls that we're making to Congress and the White House and the media, to make them doubt. Because that doubt is our most potent weapon against more war and more false flag attacks. Okay?
Well, I remember reading through that list of all the things that they wanted to have done by October 1st, and I kept thinking to myself, if the government shuts down over this budget deal, they might find themselves, because remember they contacted Matt.
I think it's less to do with the budget shutdown, because I think they're going to go ahead and put this emergency measure through, even with Obamacare. I think it's more planning for a false flag. We've got to take a break for commercials. Thank you for the call, Art. We'll be right back. America, welcome back to the show here. We're going to go back to the phones. Brent in Wisconsin. Aloha, Brent. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind today?
Yes, hello, Mike. Thank you for taking my call. I've had a question for some time on my mind about an EMP event, electromagnetic pulse, for the people that don't know what I'm speaking of. I understand that they take out electronic systems in automobiles and trucks and things of that nature.
Well, not exactly. Not exactly. The phenomenon of EMP, electromagnetic pulse, was discovered actually by accident during a U.S. atomic test in the Pacific, where they launched a nuclear weapon outside the atmosphere. And when it detonated, it seriously disrupted the Earth's magnetic field and induced voltage fluctuations in long power transmission lines. And it interfered with radios and disturbed the electricity right here on the island of Oahu, all across Hawaii. And so it's been thought this would be an effective weapon across a wide-scale area to disrupt electronics and electricity. But it really is most effective against anything plugged into the large-scale power distribution systems, because the longer the power lines are, the more the disturbed magnetic field can induce line voltage fluctuations in it. Little tiny battery-operated radios and your motor vehicles, because they're not plugged into those long transmission lines, they may be momentarily interfered with, but they're not going to stop working. So that's basically how that phenomenon works. An EMP necessary to shut down isolated electronics would involve a nuclear explosion that would basically melt the country anyway from heat. So,
sure,
you know.
I understand there may be some disturbance from solar activity later on in the fall, and I was wondering if that would affect chainsaws, log splitters, gas
probably not, and not just because it never has in the past, but because this announced solar maximum that everybody was talking about fizzled. And in fact, I just put up an article at whatreallyhappened.com where we're seeing a solar minimum that is the least active sun in the last 100 years, which is basically as long as we've been able to scientifically study the sun. This is the quietest and calmest it's ever been. And if this is a repeat of the Maunder minimum, then we are indeed looking at going into a new little ice age, which would certainly explain 67% Arctic ice growth over the last year. And we're going to have a really, really rough winter. And, of course, Al Gore's out there at his new beachfront home in Southern California crying and weeping that Mother Nature just didn't go along with this global warming thing.
Right. Well, you probably won't suffer in Hawaii there too much, but in southern Wisconsin, I better get making some firewood.
Yeah, actually, you'd better, and you ought to tell your local community to stop listening to the global warming people and make sure they've got adequate road grit and other supplies to get through a very rough winter, because what exacerbated some of these really hard winters we had over the last couple of years is that local communities tried to save money by saying, well, if the snow's a thing of the past, we don't need to stockpile road grit. We can sell off some of our snow plows. We don't need to buy new snow plows, and they got caught off guard by that.
Yeah. Well, I think it's only going to get worse. I tell people, cheer up. It'll probably get worse. So, listen, thanks for the heads up on that. That's been a concern of mine for some time, and you have a good day, and thank you again.
You're welcome. Yeah, if we get into a nuclear war with Russia or China, in all probability they will detonate a large warhead over the United States outside the atmosphere, and anything that is connected to wires that are a long distance across the ground will be subject to major voltage fluctuations, which we also see with solar flares, only obviously with the nuclear weapon it'll be considerably worse. But small, isolated systems like battery-operated radios in your car may be momentarily disrupted, but they're not going to be fried. And and of course, the good news is with more and more internet now on optical cable, which is immune to electromagnetic pulse, it also means that your internet connections are probably not going to be disrupted all that much unless the ISPs aren't filtering their power coming off the power lines. Anyway, I digress. Now, I want to get back to the economy. And this is an article we saw over at Blacklisted News here. 5 years after the financial crisis, the big banks are still committing massive crimes. And it starts out with a disclaimer saying that all banks are bad, but a significant number of them are. And the reason they're still committing these massive crimes is because nothing happened to any of the criminals behind the mortgage-backed security fraud of 2008. The Bush White House adopted as official U.S. government policy that the reputation of Wall Street and America's banks had to be protected at all costs, with all costs being dumped on you, the American people, through TARP and bailout and all these other programs and quantitative easing. And none of these bankers went to prison for what is now acknowledged to have been probably the biggest financial fraud, second possibly only to LIBOR. And so far only a couple of underling small fry have gone to prison over that one. But we're seeing HSBC whistleblowers are saying they're still laundering money for drug criminals and terrorists. They're still financing illegal arms deal. They're still rigging exchange rates to shave money off of transactions coming. They're still doing what they've always been doing because nothing bad happens to the bankers. They just go on doing what they're doing, and they say, hey, if nobody arrested us in 2008, nobody's going to arrest us in 2013. The only exception, of course, being Iceland, which had the right idea. They threw their crooked bankers in prison. They fired the government that helped the bankers loot the people. They're now basically delinking from the European central banking idea, and their economy is doing really well relative to the United States of America. I mean, if you really look at wealth disparity issues and hunger and homelessness and joblessness in the United States, we're worse off than Greece right now, and Greece is in riots. Latest survey is showing 70% of Americans think that the U.S. government is propping up the banks and big corporations at the expense of the American people. And that, by the way, seems to cover pretty much all of the 90%. I mean, 1% thinks everything's hunky-dory, and they're just going to say, oh, yes, it's wonderful. This is the way the imaginary playmate in the sky meant it for me, for me to live in these huge palaces and for everybody else to be just living in these cardboard boxes down there in the alley. But among the poor and middle-class American, the numbers are pretty much constant. 70% of the American people think the federal government is taking care of the banks and the big corporations and not the American people. And by the way, that is also fascism. Benito Mussolini, who got the Olympic gold medal for being a fascist jerk, said fascism ought to be more properly called corporatism because it is the alignment of financial corporations and government against the general population. And you don't need me to tell you, you can look around this nation right now and see that's exactly where we are. This government is all about protecting the bankers, all about protecting the corporations, whether it's Monsanto or pharmaceutical corporations, and not giving a tinker's cuss what it's doing to the ordinary American people. Now, as I mentioned just before, along with everything else they've done, the House Republicans, because the vote broke down along party lines, have voted to reduce food stamp funding by $39 billion over the next 10 years. It's working out to about $3 billion, almost $4 billion a year, at a time when food stamp usage continues to skyrocket. And the money that is in those food stamps is already insufficient. Around here, it gets to week number 3 of the month, and the last week, those people are all going hungry, which is why we're trying to step in. We'll be right back after these America, welcome back to the show here. Now, we reported yesterday on how the United States basically threw this tantrum and told the Venezuelan president that he would not be allowed into U.S. airspace over the Atlantic. Specifically, would not allow him to fly over Puerto Rico on his way to China. Make him go around, go some other place. And it basically came across as the U.S. throwing a tantrum because Venezuela, even under its new president, is still not towing the U.S. line of selling their oil only for dollars. And so the U.S. government expressed its wrath by saying, your plane must fly the other place. And obviously the backlash from that was not very good, and the U.S. has now graciously changed its mind and allowed Maduro to fly over U.S. territory on his way to China to talk about selling Venezuela's oil to China for the yuan. Now, for all this talk about nuclear disarmament that we're hearing over there in the Middle East, and then now they're ramping up to talk about Iran's nuclear threat, which doesn't exist any more than Iraq's nuclear threat or Syria's gas threat. And on the very same day that the United Nations is holding a high-level meeting on nuclear disarmament, the U.S. is going to carry out a couple of test firings of their nuclear missiles, just to prove that they are above international law. By the way, Syria has now turned over to inspectors an inventory of all their chemical weapons, which was part of the deal they agreed to with Russia. So Syria is playing by the rules and honoring their agreement, while the United States, and specifically Obama and John Kerry and Lindsey Graham and John McCain, are trying to figure some way to weasel out of this deal and make it look like it's all Syria's fault. Now, as that caller mentioned earlier, there is a growing movement for a national truckers' strike. From coast to coast, it's scheduled over the weekend of October 11th through the 13th. Truck drivers are just going to refuse to haul any freight anywhere. And there's now a call for Americans to also strike in solidarity with the truck drivers. Don't go to the stores, don't go to sporting events, and so forth. Obviously, common sense is you should have a week's worth of groceries in the house by October 10th, which will make you an official FBI terrorist suspect. If you have more than 3 days of food in your house, you're a potential terrorist. Starting to sound like a Jeff Foxworthy comedy routine. If you have more than 3 days of food in your house, you might be a terrorist. If you keep looking at your wristwatch, you might be a terrorist. If you take photos of Hillary Clinton at a speech with your cell phone, you might be a terrorist. And by the way, Hillary's security grabbed the guy and made him erase the pictures. Talk about paranoia about her image going into 2016. If you support, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States of America, you might be a terrorist. If you don't believe the official U.S. government bovine excrement about 9/11, Syria, Iraq, Gulf of Tonkin, Havana Harbor, you might be a terrorist. This is kind of like what the old Soviet Union used to do. They made every possible conceivable human behavior a cause for suspicion in order to simply go out and grab whoever they wanted. And that's what this government is doing. By making all of our behavior, using binoculars, taking pictures of public buildings, cause for suspicion, they can evade the Fourth Amendment right to privacy. We have grounds to invade your privacy. You have a wristwatch. Yeah, it was a present from my wife. It's a Casio. Solar charged, environmentally friendly. It's very cool. It's got an altimeter and a barometer and a depth gauge and a compass, and it does all kinds of cool stuff. Now then, we have talked before about how imprisoning Americans has become a profit opportunity, which may explain why the United States has the highest per capita incarceration rate of any developed nation. Because it's money. And it turns out, and this is an amazing story coming out of Blacklisted News, the contracts between the local governments, state governments, and these for-profit prisons require a guaranteed minimum of prisoners and the imposition of what's being called low-crime taxes. And basically says that the majority of these private prison contracts require the states to keep a certain level of prison population inside the prisons. And if that level drops below the minimum, then the state has to cough up additional money taken from the taxpayers. And so what they are doing is financially incentivizing the police and the court system to find people guilty of minor crimes and send them to prison, out of proportion with the severity of their crime. It is now a profit center to arrest people off the street and throw them in prison. That's not what prison is supposed to be. Prison is supposed to be about correcting antisocial behavior. In this country, prison is all about prison industries for profit. And people who misbehave socially get elected to Congress. What kind of a screwed up nation is that here? Now, Halliburton has now pled guilty in a Louisiana court to charges of intentionally destroying evidence of its role in the destruction of the Deepwater Horizon oil platform and the oil spill. The largest offshore oil spill in U.S. history. And Halliburton wanted to delink from that, and they've now had to plead guilty to willfully destroying evidence, for which they will probably get a little wrist slap, like that one J.P. Morgan just had to pay. They stole $6 billion, and they had to pay $1 billion of it back. I'd go for a deal like that. I'd steal $6 billion, and then to get off the trouble, I'd give $1 billion of it back. Sure, that's only good business. All right, I want to talk about ClimateGate a little bit. And I want to preface it with the story that I referred to earlier, where scientists were surprised over the fact that this current solar maximum wasn't very maximum at all. And in point of fact, the sun is now at a minimum, the lowest level of solar activity seen for the last 100 years. And the 100 years is significant because humankind have only had the ability to scientifically study and monitor the sun for 100 years. And during that time, they've discovered there's an 11-year sunspot cycle that lines up with a 22-year magnetic reversal cycle. But of course, there's the possibility of much longer cycles to solar activity, which have not repeated yet and therefore remain undetected. Although Russian scientists have been saying for a couple of years now that they see indications of much longer cycles at work in solar activity. And the sun is behaving right now just as it did during what is called the Maunder minimum, which was a period of zero sunspots that coincided with the Little Ice Age. And it looks like we may be going into another one, much to Al Gore's annoyance. But the carbon Nazis are not going to give up. They are not giving up. And I was rather amazed to see this story over in the Daily Mail regarding an upcoming report for the United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, who was run by that guy whose qualification for the job is he used to drive trains. And the preliminary report is already out, or it's been leaked out, and it concedes the fact that Earth's temperature has not risen for the last 15 years. In fact, it's been in decline. And apparently politicians in Belgium, Germany, Hungary, and the United States are saying this report cannot be made public because it'll provide ammunition for those who deny man-made global warming. Gee, you think? And that right there tells you that this whole human-caused global warming issue was not science, it was politics. It was a hoax to trick you out of carbon taxes and compliance with a global environmental authority. And here we have even the UN's IPCC saying all those dire warnings of global warming never came to pass. And we have all these people in governments in Germany, Belgium, Hungary, and the United States, and others, and all the carbon Nazis say, you can't let this out. You've got to keep it secret. We'll be right back. Welcome back to the show. And before we go back to the phones here, because I know we got callers waiting, I want to remind everybody about scientific method. Scientific method is your results should be reproducible. Anybody else should be able to look at the same raw data that you've got, conduct the same analysis, and come to the same conclusions. And it is one of the strengths of scientific method that as new evidence and facts surface, scientists will say, okay, our previous understanding was clearly wrong, and let us move forward. Now, this is in contrast to politics or religion that always claim to be right and never admit error. And I stress this to point out this reaction we're seeing up at the United Nations to the coming IPCC report, which concedes that Earth's temperature has not increased for the last 15 years. And a real scientist would say, okay, then obviously that whole thing about human-caused global warming has a problem. If the real world isn't matching the predictions, then there's a problem with the predictions. But we're not seeing that from the governments of Belgium, Germany, Hungary, and the United States. They're out there saying, no, you've got to hide that report. It's going to make people doubt human-caused global warming, and that's not a hallmark of science. That's a hallmark of politics. You need to believe in human-caused global warming. Pay no attention to your thermometer. Ignore the ice and snow piling up before your eyes. It may be cold where you are, but trust us, the world is broiling, and it's all your fault, and you will atone by paying us a carbon tax. And, of course, every government agency, every university, every so-called scientific educational TV channel, NASA, NOAA, Hadley, CRU, everybody who signed onto the human-caused global warming myth now realizes they bet their reputations on a busted flush. And for the U.S. government, which is already facing an epic credibility crisis over its lies about Saddam's nuclear weapons and its lies about Assad's gas and its lies about Iran's nuclear weapons, to have this whole human-caused global warming thing discredited by the UN itself is going to be another hammer blow, because the American people are going to wake up and realize that, by golly, Those independent media people were absolutely correct. This was a giant conspiracy to defraud the people of planet Earth. And it did involve multiple universities and government agencies around the globe. Gee, this proves that wide-ranging conspiracies do exist, because now we've got one right in front of us. And that's the real reason that they're trying to convince the UN not to release this report. Because instantly the reputations of all these agencies like NASA and NOAA and Penn State, Hadley CRU, University of East Anglia, the list goes on and on and on and on. All these National Geographic specials, all these Discovery Channel specials about human-caused global warming and, polar bears drowning and the rest of it are going to be instantly discredited. And as part of that larger global political awakening, the people of the world are going to realize that what government does best, in fact, the only thing government does, is just pour out the bovine excrement, and the corporate media helps them do it. And so they're going to fight this one tooth and nail all the way I can. They don't want to correct the science. They don't want to admit they were wrong. Change the data. Make us look right. Because it's more important to look right than to be right. Al Gore. Going to grab a phone call here. Jim in Georgia. Aloha, Jim. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Aloha, Mike. I agree with 90% of what you say, and I back your station, but I've got something to say about food stamps. I've heard things, and I've seen this the other day. I went into the store, and a woman bought a Starbucks coffee for $5 and a Philly cheese and onion rings, and it was $11.69. Mm-hmm. I did the grocery shopping for my wife, and and then she paid with a Peach card. It's a food stamp card.
Yes. And
I just thought to myself, for $2.50, she could have bought a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk for $3.19, 12 ounces of a 12-ounce pack of cheese for $2.50, and a box of cereal for $3. And do they have limits on what these people can buy?
Well, I think there's supposed to be limits on things like alcohol and tobacco. And I'm not going to question the fact that there are some people taking advantage of the system. That is inevitable anytime you have government hands out, whether it's free cheese in the Reagan years or free cell phones or food stamps. There will be people who will just try and take advantage of the system. But I can assure you, from all the people that my wife and I work with here on the island of Oahu, and this is the afternoon when we go off and hand out food again, the vast majority of people are just getting by. They are dependent on that food stamp money. And I, for one, am willing to tolerate that tiny, tiny fraction of people who are taking advantage of the system because they couldn't get elected to Congress, and, in order to make sure that the fragile and needy within our society are being taken care of, which used to be the job of the government, but now it's fallen onto the backs of we the people.
I agree. Our church does the same thing. We help people out with canned goods and food and stuff like that. Mm-hmm. When I see this, I know other people see it too, and they feel they're being cheated, because I wouldn't go out and spend that kind of money on a $5 for a cup of coffee and $6.95 or whatever it was for the
but let me just point out something here. All hierarchical systems inherit the morality of the people at the very top. And I understand that it's wrong for people to take unfair advantage of food stamps or any other social assistance, but then look at the example being set for them by our top bankers and by our government itself. They're probably saying, well, hey, those bankers got rich gaming the system. Why shouldn't I game the system a little tiny bit? If you want to have a moral society, it has to begin with moral leadership. And I don't mean morality where they get out there and say, oh, the gays are bad and this. I'm talking about leaders who actually lead moral lives themselves, and it's not just a morality they put on as a costume every time there's an election.
I agree with you, Mike. I've taken money out of my pocket to help people when they're at the store and they don't have money to pay for groceries. But this just makes a black eye for the people that really need it.
Well, yeah, it's there, but you know something? I ignore it. Yes, there are people taking advantage of the system, but it's a tiny minority, and I'm willing to put up with them because we have to get out there and we've got to take care of the American people. And we know that when they talk about budget and austerity in the federal government, it's always going to be more cuts to taking care of the American people so they can shower more money over war, more money over Wall Street, more money over Israel. They're spending our money everywhere but on we, the American people, and that is absolutely wrong. And because government has abandoned the care of our fellow Americans. We have to step in and fill that gap. And
I agree, Michael.
Yeah.
They're going to take them billions of dollars that they're going to cut from the food stamp program and put it into bombs. I agree with you.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay?
Thank you, Michael.
All right there. Let's see, as we head up to the top of the hour here, another article over in the Express in Great Britain, and they're whining and crying, fewer people than ever believe the world is warming up here. And they're basically talking about a study done by the UK Energy Research Centre, which received huge amounts of funding because of human-caused global warming, is showing that people who doubt the official claim of human-caused global warming has more than quadrupled since 2005. And basically, with this UN report coming out and all these hard winters, it's very obvious this whole human-caused global warming thing was just a complete fraud. It was yet in another long series of carefully crafted hoaxes to take your money and your obedience away from you under false pretenses. Meanwhile, Obama's apparently, he's getting back onto the carbon thing. He's putting limits on coal-fired plants, and he's back to talking about, we've got to have a carbon tax. We've got to have a carbon tax. We've got to fight. Well, they've rebranded. Now they're saying it's climate change, meaning it's our fault whether the world gets hot or cold. And no, it isn't. It's controlled by the sun, and it's controlled by the oscillating shape of the Earth's orbit. This is classic politics, taking something that happens naturally, declare it a crisis, and then offer to sell the people of the world a solution on easy credit terms. Plus, if you call now, a free Ginsu knife. We'll be back after Phyllis Schlafly. America, welcome back to the show, to hour number 3. Our phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. And I want to respond to Phyllis Schlafly's report there about the declining birth rates. And yes, there are multiple factors, especially during difficult economic times where people just say, I can't afford a child, I'd love to have a child, but it's just not going to work out. But there's another factor that needs to be talked about, and that, of course, is the epicite gene. And this, of course, is this corn that was developed under a U.S. Department of Agricultural grant that will render anybody who eats this corn sterile because it tricks the body into responding to human sperm as if it's an infection and prompts an antibody attack on the sperm, killing it. Now, this corn, like so many other genetically modified crops, was tested in open-air fields. And we now know, because of the contamination of wheat up in Oregon, that the pollen from these GMO plants does go wild. There's no way to stop it. And American birth rates are in serious decline. And what's really interesting is if you go back and look at the chart of birth rates, when births are declining due to social pressures, economic pressures, it tends to be a very gradual curve. It's going up and up and up, and then it starts to slow, and then it flattens off, and it starts to drop a little bit, and then it drops faster. But if you look at the U.S. birth rate, there's a very obvious point. It's going up and up and up, and then all of a sudden it's going down. And that is not typical of a declining birth rate due to economic pressures. If they have made a horrible mistake with this epicite gene, and it's gone wild, and it's now showing up in corn all over the world, that is a major, major disaster, potentially extinction-level event. People may stop eating corn completely, the way they stopped eating rye following the ergot problem in the Middle Ages. This genetic modification is the most dangerous technology ever played with. It is far more dangerous than even nuclear technology because of the potential of a mistake. They're playing with the code of life itself, and they're being very reckless with it. And that is a danger, because the money junkies are in charge of it all, and they say, just put this in here and we'll sell it. Put that in here, we'll sell it. We don't care about the long-term consequences. I've got to make my stockholders happy at the next quarterly meeting. Another story that's breaking here is apparently the International Chemical Arms Watchdog that is supposed to be implementing this deal between Syria and Russia has put off their planned meeting with Syria indefinitely. They just issued a press statement saying the meeting is postponed. No explanation, and of course, no new scheduled date. The people who want the war are desperate for the war, and they're desperate to derail the deal. And a good way to derail this deal is to simply not let it move forward, because Syria has already turned over their chemical weapons inventory to this watchdog. And the next step would be, okay, how are we going to decommission and get rid of these things? And the meeting just got canceled. Now remember, Kerry is out there pushing deadline, 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 deadline. Syria failed to meet the deadline, therefore the war is on. And Syria's going to say, we tried to meet the deadline, this OPCW wouldn't meet with us. And Kerry's going to say, it doesn't matter, you failed to meet the deadline and the war will be on. I think that's what they're trying to do here. Another bizarre story we got, even as it is becoming apparent that the flooding in Colorado compromised 1,800 fracking wells. And it's already documented that the tanks of the fracking chemicals ruptured, pipelines of the chemicals ruptured, dumped all of that stuff, plus a considerable amount of oil, into the floodwaters, which are now seeping into the soil in Colorado. And Fox News just put out this puff piece about how fracking is really good for the environment. That is a completely unsupportable statement. Now, to prove how completely co-opted by the corporations the corporate media really is, Scientific American has now come out publicly against labeling GMOs. Okay, and it's apparently there was an editorial in Scientific American saying labels for GMO food are a bad idea because they won't provide people with any useful information. It will only intensify the misconception that genetically modified foods might endanger people's health. This is basically the talking points coming out of the GMO industry itself from companies like Monsanto. There is considerable evidence that these tinkered products are not healthy. There's that French study where they fed rats on GMO corn and exposed them to glyphosate over the entire lifespan of the rats. Monsanto's own tests ended at just 3 months. And the French study showed that it's starting at month number 4. The problems showed up. And nobody can refute that study, but the government of France rejected it. Yes, you have interesting data. Yes, it seems valid, but we're not going to pay attention. Because the government of France is just as much in the pocket of the large international corporations as any other government. And for Scientific American to come out here and say you don't need to know that information, that is unscientific. If you've ever been in the lab, you know scientists want labels on everything. We need to know what's in here. Of course, Scientific American was also on board with human-caused global warming, and it's all your fault. And again, they ought to just take the scientific out of their name and just call it American Magazine. This is what you believe today. Another article came out over at Stephen Goddard talking about the very now obvious fraud regarding human-caused global warming. And he talks about how a lot of this nonsense is legitimized simply by claiming, oh, well, the government is funding this, therefore you should trust it. And, of course, if the government is funding it, is the first and best reason you should distrust everything that's going on. And apparently, the carbon Nazis are still trying to explain away the 67% increase in Arctic ice cap over the last year by saying global warming is responsible for more ice. Freedom is strength, war is peace, ignorance is slavery, warming is cooling. Raising the debt ceiling doesn't raise the debt. Fracking is good for the environment. We're in George Orwell territory for real here. Now, there's been another scandal involving one of the green companies that rose to power and profitability and prominence. And apparently, there were these companies in New Jersey that were selling what were supposed to be biofuels, e-biofuels, biodiesel, fuels created through biological processes, recycling, whatever. And it turns out they were just buying cheap fuels from other companies, produced the old-fashioned, ordinary way, running up the price and selling them as environmentally friendly fuels. And apparently they took in something like $55 million in this scam of taking ordinary, everyday fuels, relabeling them as environmentally friendly, and selling them out the door. Now, there's a video on the front page of whatreallyhappened.com. I hope you'll take a moment of looking at it, because even for somebody like me who knows how much fraud is going on in our society, this is just sick and disgusting. And the video is titled Cancer Charities Ripping Off Donors, and I have to do a tip of the hat to CNN for having the courage to do this show and to put it on the air. And basically what it comes down to is there are numerous cancer charities all across America that are all owned and operated by the same family, who are drawing $250,000 a year salaries, and only 6% of the money they take in actually goes to any kind of charitable purposes. They had one company where they took in something like $6 million in donations in a year, and only $17,000 was actually spent on charitable purposes. This is why, if you want to help your local community, go out and do it yourself. Don't just write a check to some flake and think you've done enough. Aloha, America. Right, welcome back to the show here, and the U.S. stock markets are closed for the Friday, and in a very rare occurrence, we did not have the markets massaged up for their traditional Friday happy ending. The Dow closed almost 200 down, basically erasing almost all the gains from the surge that followed the Federal Reserve's announcement. Probably what it is a lot of people bought low and selling high, and they're doing profit-taking. But it's very unusual for the Friday markets to end this deeply in the red, and it's probably going to have a lot of people fretting and worrying over the weekend before the markets open on Monday. Interestingly enough, and we can score this one as a small victory for the truth, apparently Representative Jeff Miller, Republican from Florida, who's chairman of the House Committee on Veterans Affairs, stated in an interview to WTOP television that yes, Aaron Alexis was on a prescription drug with a potentially dangerous side effect that could have been a problem. Now, he's hemming and hawing and saying we don't really know, but he's saying it's time for the Veterans Administration to be forthcoming with more information on what medication not only Aaron Alexis was given that might be a problem, but for all of the veterans. Which means, of course, that Jeff Miller will not be getting any campaign donations from Big Pharma next year before the election. So if you're in Florida, you might want to call him up and give him a good attaboy and a pat on the back, because he has just invoked the wrath of Monsanto, and it is a terrible wrath to behold. Now then, other stories out here. ETF Daily News is saying the U.S. economy is getting ready to implode, which is, yeah, we already knew that. Press TV is saying the U.S. is facing a prospect of more jobless recoveries. Well, if there are no jobs, it's not a recovery, not for the American people. What they're saying is the Federal Reserve is going to go on creating instant money to pour all over Wall Street to make it look like Wall Street is still working, and they will declare that a recovery. But it isn't. The economy is not recovered until everybody has a high-paying job to service their debts, until we don't have the scale of hunger and dependency on food stamps that we see now, until our infrastructure is repaired, manufacturing is brought back. The state of the economy is not measured by how well the 1% are doing. It is measured by how well all 330 million Americans are doing, and the vast majority of Americans are not doing well at all. Real income has been in decline for 5 years. And just lying about the jobless numbers and saying, oh, really, it's all okay, you're not doing good, but that's your fault. Don't be angry with Wall Street and the U.S. government. And that's all wearing off. It's all wearing off immediately. Apparently, one of the major losers today on Wall Street was BlackBerry, and that may have had to do with the recent revelations that the NSA had backdoored even the BlackBerry, because a big part of BlackBerry's sales pitch is that they consider themselves more safe and more secure and more protected than the other competing smartphones. And it turned out, no, they're all pretty much equally open and naked to the prying eyes of the NSA. Now, Google is apparently jumping into the fray started by Microsoft and Apple for offering in-the-cloud document curation services, which is a fancy word for word processing, spreadsheet, and all that other Office suite situation, where the software is not on your computer, your data is not on your computer, it's all delivered in the cloud, and Google is now giving away QuickOffice for free as long as you sign up for 10 gigabytes of free storage. So that Google and the NSA will have instant access to all your business secrets. And we're seeing all over the world where people are unplugging from all this cloud-based stuff. And American high-tech companies that signed on to the NSA's agenda are taking it in the teeth. Because everybody on planet Earth wants a sense of privacy about their business, about their romantic letters to their significant others, about their aunt's top-secret chocolate chip cookie recipe. They are offended by this model of a government that watches every single thing that you do, and they are taking steps to protect it. Now, here's an interesting development, because you're probably aware that a lot of modern encryption relies very heavily on random number generation, or pseudo-random number generation. It's actually very difficult to get really random numbers out of a computer. Most of the supported random number functions in, for example, the C programming language, if you seed them with the same number, you will get the same random numbers coming out in the same sequence. Now, the people over at RSA Security, who are behind not only RSA itself, but public key cryptography and a lot of other systems, have now gone back on themselves regarding a specific type of random number generation that they are now saying they are agreeing with experts has an NSA backdoor in it. And the type of encryption, or rather the type of random number generation they're talking about, involves what is called dual elliptic curve deterministic random bit generator. And it's supposed to be a very secure, very close to truly random number generator. But a lot of critics have been pointing at it because it's computationally intensive, far more so than it should be. And now analysts have basically said that if you have a certain set of numbers to apply to the random number, it's essentially a skeleton key. And they can basically figure out what the original random string was going to be in order to decode your message. And so now RSA is telling their customers to drop this. To get out of it, it appears to have been backdoored by the NSA. Now, as we proved with our NSA challenge, if you need to have complete security from the NSA, you need to develop your own encryption. And it doesn't have to be sophisticated. It just has to be a method the NSA is unaware of and not used to dealing with. And they will not be able to decode your traffic. We had 3 NSA challenges. Not one of them was solved. And in the last NSA challenge, we actually provided the key. Because breaking a message is a 2-step process, finding the method and then finding the key. And of the two, the method is the hard part. The Allies were not able to break the German Enigma code until they got their hands on an actual machine. Then once they had the machine, they had the method, and finding the keys was comparatively quite easy. And that's what we proved with our 3rd NSA challenge, because we handed the key out with the encrypted message, and they still couldn't break it. And if you have 100 million American businessmen who've all crafted their own system of encryption with their own methodology, the NSA is not going to be able to do anything about it. They rely on everybody using encryption standards, where they already know the methodology, which makes finding the key very, very easy. Now we're finding out they backdoored the industry standard in random number generation, just like they backdoored DES with the work reduction packet, and they backdoored Clipper with the law enforcement assistance field. Now we're getting this article over here on 12160.info, where the original creator of Linux, which was a port of Unix for small machines, has now gone public saying the NSA approached him about a backdoor into Linux. We'll be right back after these commercials. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about NSA Gate. And if Obama thought Floodgate was going to go away because of Syria and Obamacare, which actually Obamacare is another gate, that was written by the health insurance companies. Make it all mandatory the way the auto insurance companies did it. Raise the rates, lower the services and the payout, reap huge profits for the corporations here. Now, every time we talk about the abuses of the Constitution by all this spying on ordinary Americans, we're always told that all of this is approved by the Foreign Intelligence Service Act Court, the FISA Court. There are a couple of problems with that. First of all, as the name foreign implies, its actual jurisdiction is outside the United States of America, where the Fourth Amendment is not applicable. It never had jurisdiction inside the United States of America, and yet we're constantly being told, oh, the FISA Court says it's okay. The FISA Court isn't allowed to say it's okay under the Constitution. Well, apparently, 2 of the judges on the FISA Court have been complaining to the Justice Department that when the NSA comes into their court to get their rubber stamp, that the NSA lies to them, has just completely misrepresented the scale and method of all this harvesting and analyzing of all of our communications records. One of the judges, Reggie Walton, in 2009, said that it was time to start holding these NSA officials in contempt of court and refer their conduct to outside investigators, including the Department of Justice. Now we are hearing from the Department of Justice that their internal ethics watchdog never investigated the complaints. We don't need to investigate the NSA. They're a swell bunch of Joes. And probably that internal ethics watchdog got a late-night phone call from the NSA replaying his calls to Fifi's phone fantasies or something like that. Meanwhile, Russia, which does maintain a website block list on grounds of things like child pornography, promoting illicit drugs, and copyright infringement, has now added Facebook to their block list. Ooh, bad Russia. No cookie. No browser cookie at any rate. And a lot of people seem to be very upset about it, and they're saying bad Russia, but the complaints are coming from the same people who are always screaming about copyright infringement in the United States of America. And when Russia actually starts enforcing that, all of a sudden Russia's the bad people. But I think what's going on is that this blacklisting of Facebook is part of the growing backlash against this NSA scandal and U.S.-based Internet companies who have all now acknowledged cooperating with the NSA spy scandal. And on that context, I can't say I blame Russia one little bit. And remember, we were reporting yesterday how the BRICS nations are now setting up their own Internet that operates outside the United States. Doesn't go through U.S. servers, doesn't go through any place where it's going to be tapped into by the NSA. They're laying their own cables, they're setting up their own Internet, and I'm sure the two will talk to each other, but traffic on the BRICS net is going to be far removed from all the back doors built into the U.S. net by the NSA to protect their business secrets. And again, you cannot trust this government not to steal your business secrets because they've been caught doing it before. I've lost count of the number of surveillance people who've been busted for insider trading based on what they're taking from your computers, your laptops, your tablets, your smartphones. And remember, all of it is made available to the government of Israel. The raw take on all of America's surveillance by the NSA is made available to Israel. Israel's trying to deny it and scream, oh, you're just anti-Semites. But remember, a lot of these companies that are contracted to implement things like PRISM are Israeli-owned in this claimed operation to preserve the security of the American people, the NSA has made us completely insecure to Israel. And I might add, all the cyber criminals. Because all of these back doors that are being built into your computers, whether it's NSA key on the Windows systems or whatever they have in Apple and whatever they put into Linux, the hardware backdoors in the routers are discovered and exploited by the computer criminals as well. And the attitude of the U.S. government is, who cares if the American people are being ripped off by identity thieves and people looting their computers? It's a small price to pay to make sure those American people aren't getting ready to fire the government, which is what this is really all about. We have gone so far past what the Stasi was doing to the people of East Germany. We've gone way past what KGB and GRU were doing to the citizens of the Soviet Union. And it's time to wake up and recognize it. This government is so afraid of you. They have to watch you 24 hours a day, track you through your cell phones, watch all your financial transactions. Every time you swipe that little ID card at the supermarket, they're keeping track. Are you buying too much chlorine bleach? Are you buying too much toilet bowl cleanser? They're afraid of you because you are awake. Your eyes are open. Your minds are engaged. Your skepticism is in afterburner overdrive. And this government has survived so long on illusion and fraud. They don't know any other way to operate. And that's why, even though recent years have seen exposure after lie after lie, the government goes online. They don't know what else to do. That's why we had John Kerry with his press conference earlier in the week, looking very haggard, I might add, still out there saying, yes, Assad gassed his people. Yeah, we know it, we know it. Somebody actually sent me a PDF that Nancy Pelosi is mailing out in response to emails criticizing the war in Syria. And it's something like 4 pages of, we know Assad did this, we know Assad did this. You know, this PDF is the proof that Assad did it. No, it isn't. It's a PDF full of assertions and accusations, and there is no proof at all. And again, the story just doesn't make any sense, because they're still trying to sell you the idea that Assad allowed the UN inspectors into his country, and on the very day they arrived, he launched a gas attack not against the hired mercenaries trying to oust him, but against women and children of his own supporters and his own soldiers right in front of those inspectors. And nobody can explain why Assad would do something that obviously stupid, why he would even think it necessary. There's no motive for Assad to do that. There's plenty of motive for the U.S. to fake it, plenty of motive for the rebels to fake it and frame Assad, and we do know from emails leaked from Britham in January, there was a plan to do just that. But you know, when you have a government that's living on lies, all the lies have to be protected. When you are a government that has lived on lies and fraud and deception, you can never, ever, ever, ever admit to any one of them, or the rest will unravel. And that's why Kerry is still on TV saying, oh, we know Assad did it. They know they're not being believed, but they can't back off and say, gee, shuckies, you caught us, because then it would all start falling apart. So they're now stuck with this unsupportable lie. And the more they keep trying to sell it, the more they destroy their own credibility. And they're out there whining and saying, oh, it's those bloggers, it's the independent media. Kerry's out there saying the Internet's making it impossible for us to govern. No, it isn't. If the government is facing a credibility of crisis, it is not the doing of the blogs and the independent media. It is the doing of the government itself that sees lying to the people as a legitimate tool of governance. Mr. John Kerry, you did it to yourself. This government destroyed its own credibility by arrogating to itself a right to lie without shame to the American people, not once, not twice, but as a permanent policy of control. And now it's falling apart. And they don't know what to do. And they're desperate. And that's why I keep saying we have to keep sending the message to everybody in Congress, everybody at the White House, everybody in the corporate media. We don't believe you anymore. We have to shatter that confidence that some of them still seem to have, that if they just make the lies big enough, they'll be believed, that we'll forget about all the floodgate, salute the flag, and throw our babies onto the designated enemy's bayonet. We have to make them doubt. We'll be right America, back. Welcome back to the show here, and we're getting a story here. Apparently Nancy Pelosi is very, very unhappy over the House of Representatives defunding Obamacare. How could they do that to her? And she's expressing her ire and anger, and no doubt even now engaged in massive arm twisting because the Senate version of the emergency spending bill, which is basically a bill to grab more of your money and spend it on things other than you, is expected to remove the language defunding Obamacare, which will lead us into a week of rancorous debates regarding Obamacare before the House finally concedes and says, all right, you can have your Obamacare. We got to keep the salaries going to our staff, and I got to keep the money flowing to pay for my plush office here in the Capitol building. And now's the time for you all to make noise. We already showed that if we make noise, we can still influence this government. We did it with Syria. And we need to remember that success. Now, we haven't ended the war in Syria, but we seriously derailed it. And we sent a message to the world that we're not buying this nonsense about Assad gassing his own people any more than anybody else around the world is doing. So you got to keep up the pressure. And especially the House of Representatives is the weak point, because every single one of those people is up for re-election next year. And so you call your representative. You can go to congress.org and get all the contact information for your representative from your district. And you call and you say, we know you're lying. And when this nation goes to war, you're out of a job. I will do everything I can within my district to make sure you are not reelected. If you cave in on Obamacare, I will do everything in my energy to make sure you're not reelected. Just start getting that list out there and encourage everybody around you. The time for polite silence is over. Now is the time for all Americans to be out there screaming their rage and anger at this out-of-control, unconstitutional, and illegitimate federal government. Now then, getting back to some news stories. Oh, poor Pelosi, she's so unhappy. My heart bleeds for Nancy Pelosi right now. If you are my age and you remember the glory days of NASA, you'll remember the name Chris Kraft, who was NASA's original flight director and figures quite prominently in the history of America's early successes in space exploration. And he's basically come out calling the agency's direction a tragedy, and he's absolutely correct, for a wide variety of reasons. When I was with NASA, they were just going through the transition to what was called the new NASA, where control over mission planning and execution was taken away from the scientists and engineers and given to a bunch of politically appointed MBAs who promised they were going to make NASA more businesslike, which led to all kinds of disasters. I mean, the new NASA celebrated its rise to power by getting rid of the old meatball logo and replacing it with the worm, which was that little red NASA logo, which was such a huge disaster. Now they're back to the worm. They're back to the meatball, rather. And started playing money junkie games with space exploration, which led to disasters like Challenger and Columbia. Mars Polar Lander, the Mars Climate Observer. They literally flew that ship out to Mars and ran it right into the planet because one group was on metric and the other was on avoirdupois. Do you realize the United States is one of, I think, only 3 nations on Earth that is not using the metric system? And NASA really did lose its way. And yes, defunding was a big part of it. But Obama is the first president since Eisenhower to preside over a nation without a manned space program. And it's not that I really care all that much about planting flags on the moon or asteroids or the rest of it, but NASA was the civilian technology incubator that gave us the tech boom of the 70s and 80s and early 90s. And we don't have a civilian technology incubator any longer. All the technology is being developed by the military for cooler ways to kill people, and they don't share that with anybody. So after all those trillions of dollars going into military development, we don't get anything with which we can develop new products, new industries, and new jobs with, that we did with NASA. And of course, NASA, with the new NASA management, became politicized. And I personally experienced that on Viking. And we've seen it over the last several years as NASA has sold its soul onto this human-caused global warming hoax. And I'm rather sad to watch the decline, because I used to take a great deal of pride in having been part of NASA in those days. Little tiny part, but still a part. Now, the other day I was flipping around the channels on cable TV, desperately trying to find something I had not already seen 86 times. And I stumbled across this very bizarre show called Toddlers and Tiaras. My wife is laughing in the other room here. And it's apparently a reality show about these beauty pageants for little tiny kids, little tiny girls. And I think it's a little sick. I mean, can't we let kids be kids for as long as possible? And I didn't watch the show for very long, but I could see what was going on. You have a bunch of mothers who were former beauty contestants themselves, and they didn't win, and now they're trying to relive their dreams of beauty pageant glory through their daughters vicariously. And these little kids don't want to do this. I mean, what's done to them to get them into these costumes and get them to do what it borders on child abuse in my mind. I mean, literally duct taping the kid to give her a waistline. I mean, it's just sick. And I'm not the only one who thinks so. Because France has now taken the step of banning child beauty contests to stop the abuse and what they call the hypersexualization of young girls, and I'm fully in agreement. Isn't it weird we socially condemn pedophilia, and rightly so? At the same time, we have reality shows about beauty pageants that are taking 5-, 6-, and 7-year-old girls and making them look like Miss America. And boy, when you reach that stage, you know American corporate television has hit the nadir. They're scraping the bottom of the barrel. You know, I've been wondering for years, when is the reality show craze going to stop? And it isn't, because reality shows are very inexpensive and they need to fill the airtime. And I will tip the hat to HBO for some of their programming, especially the newsroom. Most of the time, though, we watch BBC America because they're putting out good programming to watch, like Copper and Broadchurch. But what's on the American networks right now is it's junk. It's absolute junk. And just like I've seen the decline in NASA since I left there, I'm looking at the decline in the quality of American film and TV, having spent a significant part of my life in that industry. And it's like, I wouldn't want to be involved in that anymore. I wouldn't want to be going out and doing reality shows about these people just behaving bizarrely. I mean, I thought about, as a joke, piloting a reality show called Blogger about myself, but I figured it would just be 30 minutes of me typing into a computer and swearing, and nobody was going to buy that. But I don't know. Looking at some of the stuff that's out there, maybe they'll go for it here. Yes, from Hawaii, Blogger. It's about as entertaining as some of these others. But I couldn't believe, because I remember back when the young girl, Ramsey was the family name. JonBenet Ramsey. And she was one of these child beauty queens. And she was murdered among allegations of all kinds of socially disruptive behavior within the family. And at that time, people were saying these beauty pageants for little girls, there's something psychologically wrong there. And I'm in agreement. And apparently it's still going strong. Couldn't believe that. All righty, it is the end of our broadcast week. Claire and I have to go on out of here and start feeding some hungry people on this rock. We will be back Monday. here on the Republic Broadcasting Network. And a final reminder, please go over to Republic Broadcasting. Hit that donate button. We don't get money from Monsanto. We don't get money from big pharmaceutical companies. We don't get money from the oil companies. We certainly don't get any money from the government. We need your help to stay on the air. Republic Trading Group for your physical silver and gold. Have a good weekend. Aloha, America.